September 30th, 1942, the North Sea, north of Ameland Island in the Dutch Wadden Sea. 9 British motor torpedo boats and motor gunboats from the 21st MTB flotilla cut their main engines and glided forward on auxiliaries. The sea was calm, the night moonless. Perfect conditions for what Lieutenant Peter Dickens had in mind. German Convoy 348 had left Cuxhaven that morning. 8 merchant ships loaded with Swedish iron ore, bound for Rotterdam. 5 armed patrol boats escorted them, bristling with 88mm guns and anti-aircraft weapons. The Germans believed themselves safe in their own coastal waters. They positioned their escorts to defend against air attack. They expected any surface threat would come from seaward, from the direction of Britain. They were wrong on both counts. The Germans never expected British motor torpedo boats to attack from the land side. They never expected 9 small wooden boats to tear apart a British and oded, heavily defended convoy in waters the Kriegsmarine considered secure, and they certainly never expected to lose 2 ships before dawn while the British sailed home without a single casualty. This is the story of how Lieutenant Dickens and his flotilla proved the Germans catastrophically wrong. In 1942, Britain faced a problem along the Dutch coast. German convoys shuttled 2 to 3 million tons of iron ore annually from Scandinavia to the Ruhr through the Wadden Sea coastal route. This wasn't a luxury, it was survival. Without Swedish iron ore, German tank production would collapse. Without Norwegian iron ore, German artillery shells would stop rolling off assembly lines. The Royal Navy knew it, the Admiralty knew it. And on the night of September 30th, Lieutenant Peter Dickens knew it. Dickens commanded the 21st MTB flotilla from HMS Beehive at Felixstowe. At 32 years old, he'd already earned his Distinguished Service Order for previous actions. He was methodical, aggressive, and utterly convinced that motor torpedo boats could do what larger warships could not. They could slip into shallow coastal waters, strike hard, and vanish before German reinforcements arrived. His flotilla consisted of 2 types of craft working in combination. The motor torpedo boats, or MTBs, carried 18-inch torpedoes capable of sinking merchant ships. The motor gunboats, or MGBs, bristled with 20mm Oerlikon cannons and Vickers machine guns. Together, they formed a tactical system the Royal Navy had perfected over 18 months of bitter experience. The MGBs would engage the escorts with overwhelming firepower. The MTBs would slip past and torpedo the merchants. The Germans had no equivalent doctrine. Their E-boats operated independently, relying on speed and surprise. British coastal forces had evolved something more sophisticated, something the Germans were about to experience firsthand. Intelligence reached Felixstowe that Convoy 348 would transit north of Ameland Island on the night of September 30th. 8 merchants, 5 Vorpostenboot escorts. Dickens gathered his commanders, MTB 234, MTB 230, MGB 21, MGB 18, MGB 81, MGB 86. 3 more boats whose designations history has lost, but whose crews were just as ready. They sailed from Felixstowe as the sun set, 150 miles to the Dutch coast. 6 hours of cold spray and diesel fumes, and men checking their weapons in the dark. They reached the patrol area before midnight. Dickens ordered engines cut. Listen. Then they heard it. The low thrum of diesel engines, multiple ships moving in formation. The convoy. Dickens made a decision that would define the engagement. Instead of attacking from seaward, as the Germans expected, he would approach from the land side, from the north, from the direction of the Dutch islands. The German escorts had positioned themselves facing outward toward Britain, their 88mm guns pointed toward the open sea. Dickens would strike from behind them, from the one direction they'd left exposed. But first, he needed to see what he was shooting at. At 23:50 hours, the rumble of aircraft engines echoed overhead. Royal Air Force bombers, coordinating with Dickens, dropped parachute flares above the convoy. White magnesium light flooded the sea. For 30 seconds, perhaps 40, the entire German formation lay exposed. 8 merchant ships in 2 columns, 5 Vorpostenboots spread among them. The escorts scrambled to launch their own flares, trying to illuminate the attackers they knew must be coming. Dickens gave the order, Attack! The MGBs surged forward at 40 knots, their Packard engines roaring to full power. They opened fire at 1,500 yards. 20mm Oerlikon shells tore across the water in glowing arcs. Tracer fire from twin Vickers machine guns stitched patterns through the darkness. The German escorts returned fire immediately, their 88mm guns booming, but they were shooting at targets moving at speeds they'd never trained against. MGB-18, commanded by Lieutenant Smythe, charged directly at the nearest forepostenboot. Her Oerlikons raked the German vessel's deck, killing exposed crew members, silencing one gun, then another. The Germans fired back desperately. Their 88mm rounds shrieked overhead, too slow to track the racing British boats. While the MGBs drew the escort's attention, the MTBs slipped past. MTB 234 closed to 800 yards on the merchant column. Her commander gave the order, fire. Two 18-inch torpedoes launched with a hiss of compressed air. They entered the water, their engines kicked in, and they raced toward the convoy at 40 knots. 20 seconds later, one struck the Tula, a Swedish-registered freighter carrying 2,533 tons of iron ore. The torpedo hit her amidships. The 21-kilogram warhead detonated. The explosion broke the Tula in half. She folded in the middle, her bow and stern lifting as the center collapsed. Within 90 seconds, she was gone. Her crew of 11 men had no chance. 10 went down with the ship. One survivor clung to the mast, screaming for help until a German patrol boat fished him from the freezing water hours later. 2 women had been observed aboard the Tulle earlier that day. The Germans noted it in their reports. Their fate remains unknown. The second MTB torpedo missed, passing between 2 merchants and vanishing into the darkness, but Dickens's boats weren't finished. They circled for another run. Meanwhile, the MGBs continued their savage work against the escorts. The German Vorpostenboot were formidable vessels. Converted fishing trawlers, they carried crews of 60 to 70 men and mounted serious armament. The 88mm guns could kill a motor gun boat with a single hit, but the guns sat in open mounts without armor protection. The crews stood exposed to British fire. Aboard Vorpostenboot 1313, Matrose Bernard Torzinski manned the forward 88mm cannon. This was the ship's maiden combat voyage. Torzinski was terrified. He admitted it later, decades later, when German veterans finally spoke openly about the war. He described the moment the parachute flares ignited. Shortly before midnight, we heard the sound of plane engines, and soon parachute flares were dropped above our convoy. And then the fireworks began. We fired flares ourselves to be able to see the enemy. I heard an explosion to the left of our ship. Later I was told that a ship from the 20th Vorposten Flotille had been sunk. The ship Torzinski heard exploding was Vorpostenboot 2003, formerly the Belgian patrol vessel Ludsboot 7. An 18-inch torpedo caught her in the engine room. The detonation tore through her hull. She rolled onto her beam ends and sank within minutes. Of her crew of 42 men, 21 died. Not one has a known grave. They're listed as missing, lost somewhere in the cold waters north of Ameland Island. Torzinski kept firing. I operated the 8.8-centimeter cannon at the front of the ship. We didn't have any steel plate covering. The cannon was wide open. After all, 5 of us were wounded. There were only 2 crew members left to perform some of the combat tasks. Then British fire found him. A 20mm Oerlikon round struck Torzinski in the left shoulder, spinning him away from the gun. He collapsed onto the deck, bleeding, certain he was dying. But something inside him refused to quit. This is the part of his account that's most revealing about what the Germans faced that night. I can't for the life of me remember whether it was fear or bravery that drove me, but I got up, grabbed an 8.8-centimeter shell, pushed it into the gun barrel, and yelled at my leader, "Loaded." I saw the shell hit the MGB with my own eyes. That shell struck MGB 18. It hit her bow, blowing away 9 or 10 feet of her forepart. The explosion ignited fuel tanks. Fire spread across the deck. Lieutenant Smythe tried to maintain control, but the boat was doomed. She began taking water, her bow settling, flames climbing higher. Smythe gave the order to abandon ship. His crew went over the side into the North Sea. The water temperature was 14 degrees Celsius. A man could survive perhaps 30 minutes before hypothermia killed him, but Peter Dickens had been watching. The moment he saw MGB-18's crew in the water, he brought his own boat alongside. Under fire from German guns, with shells falling around him, Dickens held position while his crew hauled the survivors aboard. Every single man from MGB-18 was pulled from the sea. Not one drowned. Not one was left behind. Smythe scuttled his burning boat to prevent capture. MGB-18 sank north of Ameland, the only British vessel lost that night. The Germans claimed victory. Their radio broadcast 2 days later announced 5 attackers sunk and 2 others heavily damaged. They mentioned Bernard Torzinski by name on the messages from the front program, praising his courage under fire. Torzinski was wounded, but alive. His captain, Oberleutnant Egon Telgman, had survived, despite his ship taking catastrophic damage. But the German claims were propaganda. MGB-18 was the only British vessel lost, scuttled by her own crew, not sunk by German guns. The other British boats sustained damage. Bullet holes, shrapnel scarring. One boat's bridge shot through. But all made it home to Felixstowe. All their crews survived. The Germans lost 2 ships, 21 dead aboard Vorpostenboot 2003, 10 dead aboard the Thule. At least 5 wounded aboard Vorpostenboot 1313. Total casualties, 31 killed or missing, with an unknown number wounded. But there's another detail in Torzinski's account that reveals why the Germans lost this engagement. He mentioned their helmsman, Steuermannsmat Erwin Baumgart. During the chaos of battle, Baumgart saw torpedo tracks approaching. Without waiting for orders, he threw the wheel hard over. The torpedoes missed by meters. Baumgart's initiative saved Vorpostenboot 1313, but later, Captain Telgman officially reprimanded him for acting without orders. This wasn't unique to Telgman. This was German naval doctrine, rigid command structure, wait for orders, don't improvise. The Royal Navy had spent 3 years of war learning the opposite lesson. Initiative at every level, trust junior officers, adapt faster than the enemy. The British crews attacking Convoy 348 didn't wait for permission. When MGB-18's crew went into the water, Dickens didn't radio Felixstowe for instructions. He rescued them. When the MTBs saw an opening in the German formation, they took it. When the MGBs engaged targets of opportunity, they fired. The Germans followed their doctrine, and they paid for it with 2 ships and 31 dead. The strategic impact of the Ameland action extended far beyond one night's losses. German convoys transported over 2 million tons of cargo through the Wadden Sea in 1943 alone. 998 merchant ships carried 2,119,466 tons that year. Lose enough of them, and the German war economy would strangle. Between September 1942 and mid-1944, British motor torpedo boats and motor gunboats fought several dozen sea battles in the Wadden area. They sank or heavily damaged 14 German vessels. They disrupted convoy schedules, forcing ships to wait for heavy escorts or sail by night. They proved that Germany's coastal waters were not safe. The Germans responded by increasing defences, more Vorpostenboot, more anti-aircraft guns, faster convoy speeds where possible, but they couldn't escape the fundamental problem. Britain owned the night. British radar could find German ships in darkness. British torpedoes could sink them before dawn. And British crews had developed tactics the Germans couldn't counter. By August 1944, no German ships sailed through the Wadden Sea by daylight. The Royal Air Force strike wings had made daytime transit suicidal. The only option was night sailing. But night sailing meant facing men like Peter Dickens and crews like the 21st MTB flotilla. The Ameland action demonstrated something the Germans had consistently underestimated. British motor torpedo boats weren't just fast patrol craft. They were weapon systems crewed by men who'd learned their trade through 3 years of brutal combat. The Royal Navy had built 2,000 coastal forces vessels by war's end. They fought over 900 actions. They sank approximately 400 enemy vessels. They earned 3,000 decorations, including 4 Victoria Crosses. Coastal forces had the highest rate of gallantry awards per capita of any Royal Navy branch. This wasn't because they were reckless. It was because their job required getting close to the enemy, trading fire at ranges where both sides could kill each other, and trusting that British training, British tactics and British courage would prevail. On the night of September 30th, 1942, that trust proved justified. Lieutenant Peter Dickens survived the war. He retired as Captain Peter Dickens, DSO, DSC. In 1974, he published his memoir, Night Action, MTB Flotilla at War. He had access to German records by then, captured documents and post-war interviews. His book revealed the dramatic differences between British observations and German reality, what the British thought they'd achieved versus what the Germans actually experienced. The Aimland action was one example. Dickens's flotilla believed they'd inflicted heavy damage. German records confirmed it. 2 ships sunk, dozens of casualties, a convoy disrupted and delayed, strategic cargo lost. But Dickens also learned that German claims of sinking 5 British boats were complete fabrication. Only MGB-18 was lost, and she was scuttled by her own crew after being damaged. Bernard Torzinski survived as well. He recovered from his shoulder wound. He served through the rest of the war. Decades later, he told his story to Dutch researchers documenting Wadden Sea naval actions. His account provided the German perspective that British historians lacked. He described the terror of facing British motor torpedo boats, the chaos of parachute flares and 20mm fire, the sound of torpedoes hitting ships nearby, the desperate courage of German crews trying to defend their convoy with everything they had. Torzinski didn't glorify the fight. He didn't claim victory. He described survival. He described watching friends die. He described British tactics that German doctrine couldn't handle. He described a night when 9 small British boats proved more dangerous than the entire German escort force could contain. The Royal Navy called these engagements the Battle of the Narrow Seas. Hundreds of actions fought in the Channel, the North Sea, the Mediterranean, even the Adriatic. Most lasted less than 30 minutes. Many involved fewer than a dozen boats per side. But cumulatively, they achieved something no capital ship could match. They made Germany's coastal waters uncontrollable. The Aimland action was one night's work. 9 British boats against 8 German merchants and 5 escorts. 2 German ships sunk, 31 German dead. 0 British fatalities. 1 British boat lost, scuttled by her own crew after rescuing every man aboard. The Germans expected British boats to attack from seaward. The British attacked from the land side. The Germans positioned their escorts to defend against air attack. The British coordinated with aircraft to illuminate the convoy, then struck with surface torpedoes. The Germans relied on their 88mm guns to keep British boats at bay. The British MGBs closed to point-blank range and shot the gun crews off their mounts. At every decision point, German doctrine failed to match British reality. At every moment of crisis, British crews adapted faster than German commanders could respond. The result was 2 ships on the bottom of the North Sea and a convoy that limped into Rotterdam short of the iron ore Germany desperately needed. This was the pattern repeated hundreds of times across 4 years of coastal warfare. British motor torpedo boats and motor gunboats proving that speed, aggression, and tactical innovation could defeat heavier armament and larger crews. Small wooden boats crewed by young officers and ratings, demonstrating that courage backed by sound doctrine beats rigid command structure every time. The Germans never expected 9 British boats to tear apart their convoy in waters they considered secure. They learned otherwise on the night of September 30th, 1942. They learned it at the cost of 2 ships, 31 lives, and the illusion that their coastal convoys were safe from British attack. Peter Dickens brought every one of his men home. Not a single British casualty, not one man left behind when MGB-18 went down. That's the measure of the action. That's what British crews achieved when they faced German forces in the narrow seas. The iron ore aboard the Thule never reached German factories. The crew of Vorpostenboot 2003 never sailed again. Bernard Torzinski carried a British bullet in his shoulder for the rest of his life. And Lieutenant Peter Dickens added another line to the record of British motor torpedo boat operations that the Admiralty would study for the rest of the war. 9 boats, 8 hours from Felixstowe to the Dutch coast and back, 30 minutes of sustained combat, 2 enemy vessels destroyed. Strategic cargo denied to German industry. Every British crew member safe. The Germans never expected that outcome when Convoy 348 left Cuxhaven on the morning of September 30th. By dawn on October 1st, they knew better. The narrow seas belonged to Britain, and the motor torpedo boats proved it one convoy at a time.